We have been doing a red letter study. We're back in the red letter study. And for those of you who are just joining us for the first time in our study, we are nearing the end of the Sermon on the Mount. We're just about halfway through the last chapter, chapter 7. So Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And we're going to be getting into wolves and sheep. But before we do that, I wanted to, you know how I always kind of start in left field and then bring you back around. We're going to start in left field and see where we go from there. How about that? Have you ever wondered what Jesus would have been like as a child? What would he have been like? What were you if you were Jesus' parent or sibling? What would it have been like growing up with Jesus? Have you ever wondered that? Are you wondering it now? Well, if you have ever wondered what that would have been like, you're not alone. People have been wondering that for about 1,900 years. Basically, since the generation that grew up with Jesus died off, people have been wondering, what happened between birth and age 12? Because that's all we get. We get birth, and then we get this little snippet at age 12 where Jesus' family comes into Jerusalem, and Jesus goes off, and they lose him. And then we don't get anything until age 30. So we don't get a whole heck of a lot in the Gospels, right? We get birth, we get 12, and then we get from 30 on for about 3 years. And that's all we get. What happened in all those missing years, but especially as a child? What was Jesus like as a child? We don't have anything in the canonical Gospels, but I'm telling you, there's plenty in the non-canonical Gospels. Did you all know that there are non-canonical Gospels? The 4 Gospels that we have are not the only 4 Gospels. There are dozens and dozens of Gospels. In fact, some scholars posit that there may be as many as hundreds of Gospels that either didn't make it through the mists of time, have been lost to us, or are yet to be discovered, and so on and so forth. But there are many Gospels. There were only 4 Gospels that were actually canonized at the end of the 4th century. And so those are the ones that come down to us in the Bible. But there are many other Gospels. And one of those Gospels is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And this Gospel is a fascinating Gospel. It dates back probably to the late 2nd century. So it's a later book. But it's interesting, and it's been fascinating to me just to see how people thought. What were they concerned with? What were they fascinated by? When they were approaching their faith, what were the things that they wanted to know? And what did they write about? Now, obviously, this didn't make it into the canon, but it gives us a window into what people were thinking. And it's interesting because the people assumed that Jesus, at least in the Gospels that we have left to us, assumed that Jesus would have had all of his powers from birth. So he had all the miracle powers and all that with him, but he had to grow up into using those powers. And so it's a fascinating account where you see Jesus, and this gospel shows Jesus at age 5, age 6, age 8, and then it goes to age 12, which is the same story that we have in Luke 2. But as we see him in the earliest little stories, and all it is a loose collection of stories, but in the earliest stories, we see him as a petulant little 5-year-old. He's got a hot temper, right? And he's impatient, especially with his teachers. Imagine trying to teach Jesus. Well, he gets really impatient with his teachers because they can't teach him a thing, right? But he's also destructive. And he uses his powers in a way that I suppose a 5-year-old would. And then as the stories go on a little bit longer, we see him starting to grow into becoming a young boy who is devoted to his parents and devoted to his siblings, and eventually is concerned with trying to heal the people around him and do something good for the community, but not at the beginning. Just a few of the stories. When he's 5 years old, the first story is he's playing down at a wadi, which is a little stream or a little ford. And he's miraculously just gathering up the waters and purifying them into pools. And this is an important detail. This is on the Sabbath, so this is on a Saturday. And then he has all this mud that he has gathered there. So then he starts fashioning sparrows out of the mud. And he lines up 12 sparrows that he has made out of the mud. And of course, someone sees him doing this, and anything that was kneading was against the law. And so you couldn't do that on the Sabbath. And so one of the one of the town gossips runs to Joseph. It's always Joseph. Joseph gets all the bad news. Runs to Joseph and tells him, "Do you see what your son is doing down there? He's violating the Sabbath." And so Joseph goes down there and tells Jesus, "You can't be doing this on the Sabbath." So he claps his hands and all the birds fly away. Now, just after that, he's walking down one of the little roads there, and a boy comes running past him and jostles him. And Jesus is so irritated that he calls out to him, and the boy falls down dead. And of course, then the parents come back to Joseph and say, "Who is this boy that you've got that is killing our children?" You know. Then a little bit later on, he's playing with a bunch of boys, children, on the roof of one of the houses. And a little boy named Zeno falls off the roof. And of course, Jesus by now has a reputation, right? So they all accuse Jesus of having pushed him. And Jesus goes down and says, "Zeno, did I push you?" Immediately, Zeno comes back to life and says, "No, sir, you did not push me, but you did raise me up." Later we see him with, there is someone who is just splitting wood, and they cut off their foot, and Jesus heals it and brings them back to life because they bled out, and he puts the foot back together again. His brother James is tasked by his father to collect wood and gets bitten by a viper, and as his hand is swelling up, and he's going into shock, Jesus comes down and breathes on the hand, and it's immediately restored. And then one of his cousins gets deathly ill and dies. And Jesus hears all the lamentation and everything that's going on, and he goes on and he raises the child back to life. What we see here, of course, is not meant to be taken seriously. These are just people's stories, imagining what would Jesus have been like if you were raising Jesus, if you were growing up with Jesus, if you were just living in the village with Jesus. What would it have been like? Jesus had become such a central part of their lives. They wanted to know these things, just like I think every one of us would want to know these things. He has to grow in wisdom and in stature. Luke tells us that at Luke 2. And I think the main point of these stories is that Jesus had to grow up. He had to grow up. Whatever he understood about who he was at that age, whatever powers he may have had, he still had to grow up like any child. He had to grow in wisdom. He had to grow in stature. He had to grow in empathy. He had to grow in his ability to live in community like any child. And he did grow up, of course. And yet, this is the genius of Jesus. Even as he grew up, his main teaching to us is to live as a child. He's always telling us that we need to live as a child, because children are kingdom. This is important for us to understand, even though we're always talking about entering the kingdom, which makes us think that the kingdom is some space that we enter into, a territory that we enter into. But when the children are kept away from him by his handlers, he says, "No, let them come to me, for such as these are kingdom." The attitude of a child, the perceptions of a child, the presence of a child, the nowness, here nowness of a child is what kingdom is all about. He is always telling us, you need to live like one of these. And the word that he uses for child is talia in Aramaic. Talia means child, but you know what it also means? It also means servant, in the sense of a bondservant or a domestic slave. So what the child has is because the child is pre-egoic. The child does not have the full functioning yet. And so they can't help being what they are. But a servant does. A servant has made the choice to serve. Putting the two together, all of those attributes of a child, but also the choice of the servant, is the fullness of what Talia means when Jesus tells us we must be Talia if we want to live in kingdom. So in the wilderness, when Jesus is in his late 20s or in his 30s, when he goes out into the wilderness, he learned to grow back down again. He had grown up. Now he had to grow down. He had to learn to be a child again. He had to come full circle back to the garden where he didn't know he was naked, right? That ability to just be so present. Walk in the cool of the evening with your Lord. Jesus came full circle because he realized now that he was one with his Father. And what he found out when he found his father in that wilderness time was that the father was Talia. This is so important for us to understand. Our Father also has the attributes of a child. The God who created the heavens and the earth has the attributes of a child. Hey, man, just look at giraffes and octopus. God has to have the attributes of a child, right? I mean, who else would make that kind of design? This is great stuff. When Jesus became one with the Father, he realized that the Father was Talia. He became Talia. He learned all of this. He became Talia itself. Jesus came back from the wilderness able to see the world from a perspective only 3 feet off the ground. Not high up in some superior position, but 3 feet off the ground, which changes everything. From the standing height of a child or the kneeling height of a slave, we see life completely differently. And this is what Jesus is trying, this is what he learned and what he's trying to teach us. In that time, he put down his temptations for temporal greatness, didn't he? That need to be relevant, that need to be powerful, that need to be spectacular, which is represented in the 3 symbolic temptations that he gets laid at his feet in the wilderness. Jesus overcame all of those. He overcame the need for that egoic gratification, to be relevant, to be powerful, to be spectacular. And in his ministry, he always shook off anyone trying to put power on his shoulders. Whether it was political power, whether it was social power, he always shook it off. He never would accept it. Even right before he goes to the cross, he says, I could call down legions of angels at my defense if I wanted to, but I'm not going to do it. It's not my role to be spectacular. It's not my role to be powerful in your eyes, in the world's eyes. It's not even my role to be relevant. Do you think the political leaders really thought Jesus was relevant? He was a pain to them. He was a risk of sedition, a risk of riots if the people took over, but not Jesus himself. And Jesus always pushed it away. He always shook off any personal fame. How many times when he heals someone does he tell them, don't tell anybody what happened here, right? He's not looking for personal fame. He's not looking for political power. He's not looking for temporal greatness. He learned to put down these egoic drives for relevance and power and attention. The child, as I said, is pre-egoic. That's why he uses the child as the emblem for everything he's trying to teach us. And the servant has learned to put ego aside. This is the hardest thing that we will ever do, is to put down our ego, to step outside of those basic drives that we all have as human beings. And I suspect, I believe, and I think Jesus is showing us that this is something that we can't even do at all. Put down those egoic drives until we have become identified with something that is greater than ourselves. Now for us, we're talking about God here. To become identified as Jesus did, to become one with the Father, to become one with something that is greater than himself, brought him into that place where he could now step aside from the egoic drives. But it could be community. It could be love itself. It could be love for your children, love for your family. It can be anything that emulates the love of God in human experience, that we become identified, that takes us out of ourselves and into something larger. Jesus and us, with the Father, identified with the Father, identified with others, identified with love, we finally come to realize that greatness is not about accomplishment. Greatness is about relationship and connection. That is what Jesus is trying to get across to us. Mother Teresa has a great quote. I don't know if you've heard this one before. She says, in this life, we cannot do great things. We can only do small things with great love. That's the lesson Jesus brought back from the wilderness. That's the lesson that Jesus is trying to get across from us. And that is what the narrow gate and the narrow way is all about. What we read last week that so few go by this narrow gate. Let's read it just to remember. At Matthew 7, starting at verse 13, he says, enter through the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. So few people go by this narrow way, can negotiate this constricted gate, this gate that is thin and frail and delicate, as we said from the Aramaic, so much so that you just miss it. You just walk right past it. So few people can find the gate, recognize what it represents, move through it, and follow the narrow way because so few people stop seeking great accomplishment. We equate great accomplishment with meaning in our lives. We equate great accomplishment with approval in our lives, and ultimately God's approval, that we have to do great things, we have to obey and follow all of this and do all of that in order to be loved and approved and accepted by God. But what it comes down to is that accomplishment is ego-based. Accomplishment keeps us limited. Accomplishment keeps us inside that little bubble around ourselves that does not connect us to anything larger. And it's not that the ego or accomplishment is bad. Of course not. There are many good accomplishments that we can work for and will continue to work for even as we're on Jesus' way. Except and unless we become identified with that accomplishment, that is who we are, and that is what allows us to be loved and accepted, then it becomes a limitation. And as we seek these accomplishments, if we're not seeking them in ourselves or for ourselves, then sometimes we're seeking them in others. And this really explains this whole celebrity phenomenon that is going on in our country. And it always has, but it seems to be just going to a fever pitch where everything is about celebrities. I mean, have you noticed this? This celebrity worship that goes on, that we all want to track these people and follow these people and, in social media and in any other way that we can do it, but we're always fixated on celebrities. And I suppose in the church, we're fixated on the prophets in the church. They are the celebrities of the church, aren't they? The great evangelists and also the great prophets and whatnot. And again, we see no meaning without that celebrity. We see no meaning without that accomplishment, without that power, without that fame, without that attention. Jesus was born completely unassuming, right? And then after he grew up and could have fixated on great accomplishments in his life, trying to make meaning out of the things that he could perform, ironically, went exactly the other way and learned that the only way to the Father was through Talia. The only way to the Father was through servanthood. The only way to the Father was to become unassuming. And from the world's eyes, not relevant, not powerful, certainly not spectacular. This is alien to us. It's even outrageous in a way. And of course we say, yes, Jesus did all those miracles that were spectacular, but he did them in such a way that they were focused on individuals, and he was always trying to shuffle off the fame that was accruing to him. He always pointed toward the Father, never to himself. Even as he was doing great things, he never identified with those great things. He said, all I do is not even on my own initiative. It's only what the Father does through me. So even in the great things that Jesus did, he kept the balance. He kept his Talia spirit. So can we learn to do what Jesus did? Can we go where Jesus went? And obviously he says yes. At John 14, verse 12, he says, all you have to do is believe in me. Where you see believe, make sure you just don't think mental assent. You're just agreeing mentally with what Jesus means theologically that the church has taught us. In the original languages, both Greek and Aramaic, to believe is a combination of belief, which is idea, faith, which is action, and trust, which is experience. Really, Jesus is saying, if you trust me, if you actually follow what I am doing, do what I am doing. You can do these things you see me doing and greater things than these. Yes, we can do what Jesus did. That's why he's teaching us, exhorting us to do the things that he's doing. Jesus is telling us, yes, you can change your perspective to match your Father's in heaven's perspective, which is always 3 feet off the ground, right? It's Talia. We can become unassuming ourselves. We can become willing to be that child, willing to be that servant. And what does that mean to us? But it means to be at peace with who we are right now. Even as we're working for more, even as we're working for improvement, even as we're working to change circumstances, we're at peace with who we are right now. Why? Because God requires absolutely no more than that. God doesn't require the great things that our minds, our egos are driving us toward, that are so important to us as individuals, until we identify with and connect with that larger community, with God's community. And then we can be at peace with who we are right now and know that that is exactly okay with God right now. He loves us right now, accepts us right now. There's nothing we need to do in order to gain that love. Let's take a look at the next bit here at verse 15. Still Matthew 7. On first blush, it looks like Jesus is changing subjects here, but it's all connected. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then, you will know them. You will know these false prophets by their fruits. And so here's a question. Who were the celebrities of first century Israel? Who were those celebrities? Well, of course, you could say the king. You know, the king was a celebrity. But the king was so far removed from the people, they really had no experience with the king or the court. I mean, we're talking about the rank and file folks that Jesus was really dealing with. On a day-to-day basis, the celebrities that lived in the people's lives the most were the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, those religious leaders, those religious lawyers. They were the ones who were the celebrities. They were the ones who had the power and the relevance and all the people's attention. So here's this image that Jesus is working with. And it works on several different levels simultaneously. So the first thing is he's giving us the image of the sheep. Now, what is the sheep? The sheep to the people of the first century in Israel was as a symbol of innocence, of sincerity, and especially of harmlessness. And we still have those same symbols and ideas about sheep. In other words, the sheep was a symbol of Talia, right? Submitted, unassuming, harmless, devoted, connected, Talia. And that's contrasted with the wolves. Now, who are the wolves? Well, the wolves, of course, are at the top of the food chain, aren't they? They're pack hunters, and they're dangerous, both to people and to sheep. They're sheep eaters, all right? And so we've got these two stark connections between sheep and wolves. And here, Jesus is giving us another pair of images like he has between stones and loaves. Remember, fish and snakes, scorpions and eggs, and even the temple and the fig tree. And in each one of those, he's saying, hey, these two things may look alike. Now, we're not thinking that stones and loaves look alike, but to those people, the stones that they would, the loaves that they would bake resemble the smooth round stones that dotted the hillsides. And a fish and a water snake could resemble in the water, and even the eggs and the scorpions. We talked about the white scorpions of Judea. When they rolled up, they resembled an egg. The whole point was we need to discern which brings life, which nurtures life, and which takes it away. And when he overturns the tables in the temple and then curses the fig tree. It's the same thing. The outer appearance of the temple was if it was nurturing the life of the people, but inside it was just a den of robbers. And the fruit for the fig tree, which makes no sense to us until we realize from a distance, it looked like it should have borne fruit, even though it wasn't the season. But Jesus is trying to unmask outer forms that look gleaming and look spectacular and look powerful and relevant, but really on the inside, they don't give us anything that we need, not spiritually. And so one preserves life and the other takes it away. So here are wolves in sheep's clothing. From the outer appearance, it looks like it preserves life. But there's something else going on, and we need to be able to discern between the two. So here we have the destroyer disguised as the life preserver. And it's not that all of the Pharisees were these evil destroyers. Let's be clear about this. Many of the Pharisees were absolutely sincere in their beliefs, and they believed that they were leading the people well. But what Jesus is trying to get across is their system of simple, legalistic obedience would never get the people where they needed to go, never get them in connection with their Father. That's why he says you need to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees if you ever want to be part of kingdom. Now, the New Testament and also external sources describe the clothing of the scribes and the Pharisees. And this is where it even gets a little more interesting. What they would wear were usually long talits, which is an Aramaic word, a Hebrew word, for the prayer shawls that they used to wear. And these talits, they were exaggerated. They had longer tassels that the Pharisees were laying it on pretty thick. They wanted everybody to know how holy they were all the time. And so they made these elaborate prayer shawls out of pure wool or possibly actual sheepskin itself. And there was a rabbinic source that talked about deceitful men hiding under the talit, under righteous forms. And so what Jesus is setting up here is a really very thinly disguised code for the Pharisees being the ones who are literally hiding under sheep's clothing, but are as if they were ravening wolves underneath, hiding under these righteous forms, but were really taking the spiritual life of the people away. Now, the Hebrew ideal was of oneness. And for a human being, what did that look like? Oneness looked like both the inner and outward forms were exactly the same. What was inward was reflecting what was outward. Our deepest thoughts, our deepest desires were reflecting what we actually said and what we actually did. So there was integrity in the inward and outward. Sometimes we talk about the committee that talks into us in our heads. You guys familiar with that one? It's a big thing for 12-steppers. You know, you got the committee that's talking to you in your head. Well, when the committee is talking to you in the same way that you're talking to your actual community, when all of that is in one accord, that would be in accordance with this Hebrew ideal. Everything is firing together. Everything is one thing. The inner collection of voices is mirroring the outer voice, our speech and our action. And one huge difference between Hebrew and Greek thought, we are the children of Greek thought. We are in the West, right? Hebrew is an Eastern mindset, Eastern language, Eastern worldview. And one of the big differences is function over form. The Hebrews are always about function over form. For instance, if I held out a pencil to you and I said, "What is this? Describe this for me." What would you say? You'd say, "Oh, well, it's about 8 inches long, it's thin, it's yellow, it has a dark end on one side and it's got this pink end on the other side." If you asked a Hebrew to describe the same thing, you know what they would say? It's something you write with. It's all about function. We are about form. We are about what something looks like, and always at a distance. A Hebrew brings everything right up close. What does it work like? How does it work? Taste and see that the Lord is good. Don't just look at him. Taste, right? It's all about function over form. How something functions versus what it looks like or what it appears to be is what Jesus is trying to get across here. But that was baked into the cake of Hebrew thought from the beginning. So if we've got wolves in sheep's clothing, what are the Pharisees doing? What is Jesus saying that the Pharisees are doing? They have returned to outer forms only. It's all about the outer form, what something looks like. And what it looks like to them is great accomplishment. It was great accomplishment to follow the law perfectly. It was greatest accomplishment for them to climb up the social ladder of their day. What they had done is to return to an egoic identity, seeking this external greatness. But if there's no integrity between the inward and the outward, then there is no life spiritually, certainly no kingdom. It's all about this return to Talia, return to the child, a growing down as opposed to a growing up. And then he talks about these good and bad trees, and that we will know them, we will discern them by their fruits. And the truth of the matter is we can't see what is inside a person. We can't see those unseen thoughts and motives. But like always breeds like, Jesus is saying, right? What's inside is always going to come out in the fruit, in the effect. Why do you think we call this place the effect? Because that's what we're chasing. We're chasing the effect of God's love. And this is why Jesus does curse that tree and the temple, because they have no effect anymore. They are an outward form only. And this is what the Pharisees had done. They had gotten so good at the outward forms, it was as if they were wearing sheep's clothing. But they had no life. They were transmitting and teaching and giving no life to their people. Now, we got to remember that good and bad in Aramaic, tava and bisha, don't mean good and bad the way we think of it. They mean ripe and unripe primarily, but mature and immature. So if we reread that section and put back in ripe, it reads a little differently. So every ripe tree bears ripe fruit, but the unripe tree bears unripe fruit. A ripe tree cannot produce unripe fruit, nor can an unripe tree produce ripe fruit. Every tree that does not bear ripe fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. And that gives us a little bit of difference of understanding of what's going on here. Because Jesus is not making judgments on us as to how we perform in any one instance. But it is a mark on whether we are ripe enough, mature enough, in the right place, in harmony with what's going on enough, that we can be present and make our choices for the good of all under heaven, and not just egoically for ourselves. This is where all of this is going. You know, what is this ripeness and unripe? What is the good and ripe fruit? Is it deeds and accomplishment? No, that's just form. That's not the function. And as we've said so many times in here, God's will is not a what. It's not a detail. It's not a thing. It's not an object. It's not what we do or what person we marry. It's not any of that. That's not God's will. God's will is always how. How do we function in community? Are we a force for unity, or are we a force for division? And right now, through the end of this year, going through the political upheaval that we're going to be going through, that's an important thing to be asking yourself. In your community, in your family, are you a force for unity? Are you bringing people together? Even those who believe differently and whose family doesn't have different beliefs right now. Families are being torn apart by these beliefs. Are you a force for unity or division in the groups in which you function? Does the prophet, do we connect people? Are we a healing influence in the relationships in which we live? Are we simply leaving people better than we found them? Can we at least do that? I don't know if you have any people in your life that you sort of have to gird up and put on your armor before you talk to them or even answer the phone with them. And then when you get off, it's like You have to detox a little bit, you know? Are we people who are leaving people better than we found them? Are we people who are leaving people feeling good about themselves? Like somebody cares. Like there is a connection that means something in life. That's the how of God's will. That's what we're talking about, or Jesus is talking about when he talks about the ripe fruit. What is this person, this leader, anybody, us? What is our legacy, if you will? What are we leaving? You know, what's happening within our blast radius? Is it connective? Is it healing? Is it nurturing? Or is it something else? Jesus was born unassuming. He was lying in a manger. Didn't even have the proper setting that we would think that was a minimum for a child. And those who didn't grow up with Jesus imagined him powerful from birth in those non-canonical gospels that we were looking at. Those who didn't grow up with him imagined him powerful from birth and having to grow into that power. But those who did grow up with Jesus were amazed that he grew back down into Talia. They thought he was supposed to do all these great things and usher in this new political period in the life of their nation. And Jesus was about none of that. He grew back down into childlikeness. He grew back down from the world's perspective into powerlessness and servanthood. And that blew their minds. They couldn't understand why he wasn't doing the things that they thought he was supposed to be doing as their Mashiach, as their Messiah. In Jesus' ability to overcome his need for great accomplishment as a prerequisite for meaning, purpose, right? Acceptance in life, Jesus is showing us that this only way to the Father, he is the way and the only way to the Father and the Father's presence in this life is growing down. He's matching that presence, God's presence, with our own at a perspective 3 feet off the ground. To see life from that perspective is to be a part of it in such a different way than if we are far up and judging from a superior position, subject, object, to be down, connected, subject to subject, intimately. No space in between. This is how Jesus is showing us is the only way to the Father. And for those of us who are at a certain age, and you know who you are, who are retired or approaching retirement, getting to the point where all the dreams of your youth that you had, maybe you're realizing are not going to be realized in the way that you expected, wanted, desired. How are you going to live the rest of your life? Is it always going to be with regret? Is it always going to be feeling as if you left something on the table, that maybe you didn't fulfill God's will for your life, that you're something less than? Or can you grow down into the place where you are now okay with yourself as you are? Which means it doesn't mean you stop trying to write the great American novel if that's what you want to do. You don't stop trying to get that handicap on the golf course if that's what you want to do. We can still work hard. We can still keep our dreams, but they don't own us anymore. They don't determine whether we feel loved and accepted. They don't determine whether we feel that there is meaning and purpose in life. It's a completely different experience. And as we get older, it's really important that we start making that discernment, turn that corner into the second half of life, or it's going to be miserable going. This is where Jesus is trying to take us. The realization that God doesn't require great accomplishment for his love, for his acceptance, and that gives us the absolute freedom to choose love ourselves. There's no other way, Jesus says. We need that freedom of knowing that the love is already ours before we can give it away just as freely. And so ultimately what Jesus is telling us is that we can be sheep and still at the top of the food chain at the very same time. We can do both. If, after growing up into our adulthood, we can learn to grow back down into a childhood that we never really had before. Connected with God's presence and with each other in a way maybe we've never been connected before. And that changes everything. Let's pray. Father, this goes against our grain so much. It is so hard for us maybe to unsee what we've seen of the celebrity world, what we believe about it, how it tugs at us, how it is a basic identity that we have, that we are only as lovable as our accomplishments, only as acceptable as our accomplishments, that our accomplishments are the measure of who we are in your eyes, in our own eyes, in the eyes of others. So difficult to shake that. And it won't come off all at once. So Father, help us little by little to keep shedding that worldview by connecting more and more with you so that we can see who you are. That you, as the creator of everything that is, and the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, are still willing to wash our feet, willing to serve us. That you view us from straight across because that's who you are. Give us the values that we will desire, that that's who we should be as well, so that we can step into the freedom of that relationship. Thank you for being our unassuming God, Lord. Never let us forget that we can only love because you loved us first. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's all stand.